Welcome, learners, to our module on methods for studying culture and psychology. Now that we've defined what those things are, we'll define how to study them. So moving from what to how, but first, how is there a thing called skeleton racing? I don't know what it means, but Kelly Curtis, I know, is the first Black U.S. skeleton racer to compete in Olympics, and that is a moment of Black excellence. Why do you start off with Black excellence, Dr. Griffin, you might ask? Well, because these are things we don't hear about as much when it comes to people who can break barriers. So I'm exposing you to these stories on purpose. Telling our stories, or counter storytelling, is part of dismantling systemic racism, as you'll learn about in our very next lecture based on the readings, chapter 42. So as I share stories of Black excellence, you'll have no choice but to be inspired to your own greatness. And as we learned from Paulo Freire last lecture, when the oppressed liberate themselves, we liberate the oppressor as well. So let's continue in our liberation and freedom from the biased version of Western history and Western culture that we're used to. So far, we have defined culture and learned about how human culture is unique. This chapter provides you, the learner, with an overview of how cultural psychologists study culture. From what to how. So I chose these leaves to illustrate the various topics of research methods because I want to illustrate the value of research in discerning the differences and similarities in nature. Nature, like with a capital N, where human nature is a small branch of the big tree of nature. So there are many topics of curiosity, and we're going to choose to look at the branch of human nature, discerning differences and discerning similarities, using that information and combining it with wisdom to move forward and to continue to understand each other, because we all belong here and we're all stuck with each other. So the purpose of this slide is to give you an overview of the three main research designs covered in this section. There are three umbrellas of research design. One will be indigenous research design, one will be cross-cultural study research design, and the other one will be methods or cross-cultural validation. So those are the three. I'm going to give you, to start off with, a research question. This is a concrete example of the type of research question that extends across countries and other cultures. So it's not examining autism only in the US culture. We're also going to examine autism in other cultures. That question might look like, are there gender differences in autism rates for the United States and across to a different culture, Canada, across to a different culture, Mexico, across to Morocco, and across to China? Let's look at gender differences. Out of all the cultures, we're going to look at the differences only in 5 cultures. Another concrete example is, let's say I wanted to find out the relationship between McDonald's in the US and McDonald's in other countries and compare what the obesity rates are, because I think that that's pretty interesting. And I want to know, are the locations of McDonald's, does that have anything to do with the obesity rates in that particular region? You ever notice how the poorer an area or neighborhood, the higher number of fast food chain restaurants there are? And the richer an area, the lower the number of fast food franchises there are? It's really interesting. I might wonder what the reasoning is behind that. That means I'm moving into the psychology behind that. That might look like, is there a relationship between the number of fast food franchises in the United States, Mexico, Egypt, Japan, and Morocco, and obesity rates over the last 10 years. So now I'm extending across countries and across cultures. Psychologists are interested in the ways that cultural forces influence the way we think, the way we experience emotions, identity, the way we have relationships with each other, and also definitely the way we make decisions. The way I make a decision is definitely influenced by where I live. And you might think that's obvious, but because you can't see my decision making, it's a psychological process. And that makes it harder to study. And so, but just because it's hard to study doesn't mean that researchers shouldn't study it. So let's look at the way researchers do study things that they can't see. For example, parenting style, personality, things like that. Indigenous cultural research design studies are designed to study psychological processes and behavior from within a culture. Cultural psychologists believe that the cultural context, or, the environment, LA is close to water, that is a part of our environment as a city versus Las Vegas. Cultural psychologists believe that the cultural context or the environment are important elements, and so researchers who conduct Indigenous studies often live in the culture for extended periods of time. Their analysis usually includes rich, full descriptions and narrative. So they're documenting everything possible. And then later on, when they are analyzing the data, then they get to decide what might have been important and what might have just been an observation that didn't matter. But I guess the point is, the more data, the more information you can collect, the more you can write in your field notes journal about what's happening, about this culture that you're studying. Like, the more information, the better. Cultural psychologists who undertake Indigenous cultural studies firmly believe that in-depth analysis is required to understand behavior within a culture. Margaret Mead, who's on this slide, focused her Indigenous studies in Samoa on problems of child rearing, personality, and culture. So, as an Indigenous cultural psychologist, she would firmly believe that an in-depth analysis of Samoan child rearing practices or Samoan parenting styles is required. An in-depth analysis of that is required to understand the behavior within the Samoan culture. So even though her work is controversial and has been criticized, she was an early pioneer in Indigenous cultural research. So there have been some criticisms of letting an outsider into the inside of a culture, making observations, and then leaving and going back to their original country, wherever Margaret Mead came from, and sharing what she learns about Samoa. So it's like, well, you're an outsider. Should we let you in? And if we do, what will you say about us? How will you represent us to the rest of the world? So lots of research issues are inherent in the way we design research studies. Why? Because humans are full of errors, and we are certainly biased. And as we'll learn in this lecture, the hard thing about bias is that you don't know when you're being biased. So how do you get out of your own way when we don't even know that we're being biased? The image on this slide is the results from a 2007 research study on global happiness. That's definitely a psychological construct because I can't see happiness. It's inside. We're moving beyond what we can see with the visible eye. How do we study happiness? The countries in blue rated themselves as happier than those in red and orange. Cross-cultural studies compare cultures on some psychological variable of interest, like happiness, and serve as the backbone of cross-cultural research. These designs are the most prevalent in psychological research. Pardon me. Cross-cultural studies are those that use standard forms of measurement, such as Likert scales or questionnaires, to compare people from different cultures and identify not their similarities, but their differences. We will talk more about issues related to standard forms shortly, but if you don't know what a Likert scale is, it gives the person taking the test options from A to B. So it's like, how likely are you to recommend this movie to a friend? 1 star, least likely. 2 stars, maybe I will. 3 stars, very likely. If you've ever left an Amazon review and you've left stars, that was a Likert scale. Okay. Happy to make it relevant to real world context. Amazon in cultural psychology. Both cultural and cross-cultural studies have their own advantages and disadvantages. The advantage to an indigenous study would be that it is culturally sensitive. It studies people in their natural environment, and context is taken into account. However, it's difficult to make comparisons between cultures because you're only going into that one population. Margaret Mead only went into Samoa. So it's difficult to make comparisons between parenting styles in Samoa and parenting styles in America if she only did her study in Samoa. Cross-cultural studies fix that and address that disadvantage because they can make comparisons between groups. They can make comparisons across different cultures. However, and there's always a however, they are vulnerable to ethnocentric bias. So one design is not better than the other. We can acknowledge the disadvantages of whichever study we choose, and in acknowledging them, that actually shows that we're aware of the disadvantage. That lets us know, okay, I have some shortcomings in my study, so I can't say this is relevant to everyone. So maybe I'll say it's only relevant to this group. So rather, because one's not better than the other, it's the research question that drives the type of design. Let's see. Okay, now I'll summarize a cross-cultural study that explored the wealth of countries and reported life satisfaction. This researchers' study and the results are important to later content in this lecture about getting it wrong and getting it right. So the Diner research team in 2000 discovered that across more than 40 nations, there was a tendency for money to be associated with higher life satisfaction. People from richer countries, such as Denmark, Switzerland, and Canada, had relatively high satisfaction. Research participants from poorer countries, such as India and Belarus, had lower levels of life satisfaction, as might be predicted. There were some interesting exceptions, though. People from Brazil, a wealthy nation, reported lower satisfaction than did their peers in nations with similar wealth. People from Brazil, did I say Brazil the first time? I think I said Japan. Okay. People from Brazil, a poorer nation, had unusually high scores compared to their income counterparts. The researchers attempted to explain these differences, and one alternative explanation was culture. The reason why money is associated with life satisfaction differently in those countries is because, their culture is different. What does that mean? What does that mean when we say their culture is different? So using that study on money and satisfaction, in cross-cultural research, it is not enough to find differences among countries. It's like, this country's different than that one because they're different. Duh, that's not new. The researchers need to examine closely those cultures that were not consistent with the trend, Japan and Brazil in the other case, In this case, the researchers might ask whether high satisfaction in poor countries is related to something like social norms, values, religion, collectivism, or uncertainty avoidance. That's how we examine context and determine whether it is really culture. When it comes to getting it wrong, there are two main themes or issues that appear in this chapter reading on methods and in cross-cultural research. Again, a bias is hard to spot because by definition, you're biased. So how do you know when you're being biased? Finding a bias in research or applying your own bias in research means that differences that do not have exactly the same meaning within and across cultures. Things are not the same across cultures. And then equivalence. This concept is central to the third research design of method validation, which we'll cover in a few slides. But it means that there is a similarity in conceptual meaning and that empirical, scientific, original research method between cultures. It makes comparisons easier, and you can think of it as there's no bias in the research. If we're using the Diner study, we could identify potential problems with measuring wealth and satisfaction across cultures. Some of these issues may include translation issues in the research study, language issues, having a weird WEIRD lens, the context of the study itself, how the experiment was conducted, response bias, and how wealth is even measured. How we measure wealth will determine the rest of the research study that measured wealth in those different countries. This summarizes the third type of research design, which is method validation. Cross-cultural validation explores, or method or cross-cultural validation explores whether the assessments are valid and reliable when used across cultures. It tests the equivalence of psychological measures. So what I want you to know about this, as you can see, this is a Likert scale that you have probably used. Method validation does not compare people. Its purpose is to test the test or test the instrument. So if I was doing method validation, I would be testing this loved it to hated it scale, or I would call it an instrument, like a measuring instrument. Method validation helps to determine whether a test is actually measuring the same thing across cultures. For example, happiness, satisfaction, and depression are understood the same way, or are they understood the same way across cultures? Does happiness in American culture mean the exact same thing as happiness in South American culture? So how do we measure depression if different countries, or different cultures rather, even within the same country, experience depression differently? When we're talking about depression, I of course have this beautiful illustration of depression by Pablo Picasso. The phrase feeling blue, which you might understand as depression because you're in America, you're in this Western culture, but the phrase feeling blue is used to describe sadness in Westernized cultures. It doesn't translate to other languages. So if you perhaps speak another language, you might be like, yeah, we don't say feeling blue. That's like an American thing. Additionally, differences in personality across cultures could be due to real cultural differences, but they could also be consequences of poor translation, biased sampling, or differences in response styles across cultures. So words are important when creating an instrument, but equivalence of the meaning is essential. Equivalence meaning, like, does depression mean the equal same thing across these different countries that I'm measuring, or across these different cultures within the same country that I'm measuring? And I like this slide, or I like this image because it's from Picasso's Blue Period. And as I was talking about translation issues and language barriers, I love art because it transcends language. So whatever feeling blue means or doesn't mean, I get the sense that if you look at this painting for long enough, you will feel down and you will experience some of the depression that the artist went through. So anyway, this is Picasso's Blue Period, Feeling Blue. Check it out after this lecture if you want to go down the Google rabbit hole, Picasso's Blue Period. Okay, I saw this painting in the Chicago Art Institute. It was so beautiful. I had to include it in this lecture. Okay. Two important concepts related to method validation are validity and reliability. Validity of an instrument is another way of saying accuracy. Validity asks the question of whether the instrument measures what it is supposed to measure. Then we have reliability, which is another way of saying consistency. Consistency of the results or consistency of the instrument. This image provides a visual example of reliability and validity. You can think of a psychological construct as the circle and rings. So maybe that measurement of happiness, psychological construct. A survey should accurately sample the construct. It should evenly cover the circles and consistently measure the construct, meaning that attempts are clustered closely together. Many instruments, surveys, and instruments, surveys, interviews, and questionnaires that are created in the United States show strong validity and strong reliability. Yes, we love to be strong. We want to be mathematically and psychologically strong when tested in the US. Oh, but often these measures do not perform well in other cultures. So, if the instruments are not valid or reliable, then it is impossible and inappropriate even to draw conclusions about cultural differences. I'm going to say that again, louder for the students in the back. If the instruments are not valid or reliable, then it is impossible and inappropriate to draw conclusions about cultural differences. We'll now transition into an overview of issues that are relatively common in cross-cultural research. This includes sampling bias, procedural bias, instrument bias, and interpretation bias. The three designs discussed earlier are part of larger research methods, and research methods generally include an experiment, and three additional elements. So we have the experiment, then we have the observation, or the research question. Now we're starting to really design a research experiment when we ask a question. Then there's information, sometimes called data. For psychological research, this can be collected from different sources like human participants, like surveys and interviews. It can be collected from animals, especially when we're collecting data on learning. And data can be collected from archival sources like tweets and social media posts and library documents. And finally, a comparison of data is made to reach tentative conclusions. It can be helpful to link earlier concepts to research methods. So remember this from our first module. The goal of psychological research is to describe behavior, explain it, predict it, and ultimately control it. Research methods are elements used in a psychological investigation to describe and explain a psychological phenomena and can also be used to predict and control for issues through the use of systematic analysis. So by this scientific method of thinking, every time asking what's happening, and then every time after that asking why is it happening, then asking will it happen again, asking how can it be changed, and round we go until we get to the changed behavior. This is the the scientific method that is what we practice in this Western culture and definitely in psychological research. Every time. We got to go through the questions every time. We got to go through data, or we got to go through observation, analysis, and comparison every time. And as we're going through those every time, even when making systematic observations and data collection, research within and across cultures can present unique challenges. The first is sampling bias, which refers to whether the people who are asked to participate are good representatives of the culture or of the construct. Some examples of potential sampling bias would be asking middle school students about their online shopping experiences, which may not be representative in America as for middle school students in Kenya, Africa. And remember from our first module, 96% of participants in psychology studies come from weird countries, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And that the majority of these are also psychology students, not business students, not communication students, not fine art students. They're psychology majors. So now that we know that, the question of non-representativeness becomes even more serious. These pictures of Madonna and Child from Japan and Italy reflect how culture can also influence religion. Being Catholic in the United States does not have the same meaning as being Catholic in Japan or Brazil. Researchers must consider the experiences of the sample in addition to basic demographic information. So researchers must consider, are we studying Japanese middle school teenage girls in Japan, or are we studying Japanese middle school teenage girls in Brazil? Because those would be two very different studies. And again, one is not better than the other. Procedural bias, the second main type of bias, occurs because customs and expectations are different when it comes to participating in psychological research across cultures, also known as administration bias. There are three types of bias that I'll discuss, although there are infinite more. So basically, what I want you to know is that procedural bias refers to what happens during the experiment. So that would be the umbrella of bias. Let's look at three different types of, or I guess subtypes of procedural bias. The setting of the study can be small. It can be in a home or community center, or the setting can be large in the country or the region. And this can influence how a survey is administered or how participants might respond. Instrument administration refers to how the data is collected. Was it done on paper and pencil mode, or was it done in online survey mode? This may influence different levels of social desirability when participants respond. And I'll talk about social desirability. And because we are humans, we are relational beings. So of course, the relationship between the interviewer and the interviewee can present some bias. Interviewer-interviewee procedural bias refers to communication and interaction issues that occur between participants and researchers. With this type of procedural bias, we see the ideas of respect, hierarchy, of power, and translation issues. An interviewer who is not familiar with the culture may accidentally offend a research participant. Yikes. A translator may unintentionally change the nuance of questions during the process. The next slide provides an example using sign language and interpretation issues. Let's get concrete. Give me a real-world example, Dr. Griffin. The above image shows the word friend in English, Spanish, French, and Catalan, a dialect in Spain. This is all in sign language. When researchers use translators or interpreters, they should consider how subtle differences or nuances may be altered or changed. The more you know. The third type of bias is instrument bias, which is not the same thing as instrument administration that we covered during procedural bias. Instrument bias is not how the test is administered, but refers to issues with how people respond to the test. An example that you might relate to is using a Scantron versus completing an essay test. Each come with a different set of expectations and assumptions. Think about the first time you had to use a Scantron and whether you even knew what to do. Many tests that participants take rely on verbal or written information, and this, of course, assumes that all test takers can read. Familiarity with the type of test, is it a cognitive test, an educational test, personality test, or is it a card sorting test like this one? Familiarity with the type of test can influence performance. I'll say that again. Familiarity with the type of test can influence performance. The image above is a type of performance test or nonverbal test that assesses critical thinking without relying on words. If you have never completed a performance test, you might be unsure of how to behave or answer. I'll tell you right now, I'm one of those people. If you gave me this test, I would be very unsure because I have never taken this type of nonverbal test. So you're not alone if you've never seen this test before. And we know that if I had seen this test, my familiarity with this type of test would influence my performance. Let's get specific. Here's an example of research where familiarity with a test subject caused large performance differences that could have been interpreted as cultural differences. The researchers in this study examined visual spatial task performance between Greek and Chinese children. Results revealed the Chinese children to have significantly better visual spatial skills, but this was not related to intelligence. Instead, it's because Chinese writing is an intensely visual spatial task, so the children learning to write Chinese had more practice, and thus they were better at other visual spatial skills. I don't know, Dr. Griffin. I think I need another example. Another example of how response methods can alter results and impact interpretation. A study including British and Zambian children used 4 different response methods. Paper-pencil testing is a common experience in formal Western education systems. Remember that, Scantron. And making models with iron wire was a popular pastime among Zambian children. By using different response methods, either paper-pencil or iron wire, the researchers were able to separate performance bias related to response methods. Boom. I will also introduce you to more examples of instrument bias related to the way that participants answer items on a standard measure. So here we have a standard measure. It's, 1 star gets added each time, to loved it to hated it. Systemic response bias is the tendency of participants to respond in certain ways to items or scales. There are 3 main ways that research participants might produce a response bias. Socially desirable responding, which I shared before. in the paper and pencil versus computer test slide. This happens when you give an answer that makes yourself look good. I certainly am guilty of that. Oh no, I don't do it 5 times a week. I only do it 2 times a week, whatever it is. Knowing dang well I do it 5 times a week, whatever it is. If it makes me look better, I might choose that. I'm not perfect. Acquiescence bias is the tendency to agree rather than disagree on a survey. Ooh, that's me. The training session was helpful. Yeah, sure. I learned a lot from going to this conference. Yeah, totally. That's me. Quick to agree. Like, yeah, sure. Extreme response bias. These are the people who go, if the options are A, B, C, and D, these people will go A, D, A, D, A, D, D, A, D, A. Just, picking the first or last item on a scale, regardless of content. That's the extreme response bias. So in this case, you'd be like, loved it, hated it, loved it, hated it. No in between. There's also, not listed here, a reference group effect, which occurs when participants answer questions based on social comparisons with others. And then also intra-cultural research, intra meaning within, inter means between, intra means within. Intracultural research suggests that some ethnic and racial groups in the United States are more likely to respond in a biased way, suggesting cultural issues related to the testing environment itself. We also have interpretation bias. Remember from chapter 1 the concept of ethnocentric bias. I'll be revisiting this a lot, especially in every chapter we read from our textbook. So I'm glad I introduced that concept in Module 1. Ethnocentric bias is a concept that occurs when researchers interpret data and findings through their own cultural lens. This is a problem because they usually see their culture as superior to the other cultures. The cultural attribution fallacy happens when researchers find something statistically significant. So they find something that is statistically significant and decide with no evidence that the results are cultural. Classic fallacy when we discard and disregard evidence. That's not very scientific. It's certainly not very logical. Next, on to ethical guidelines here in the US that govern the conduct of psychologists and researchers. This section will also address intracultural and ethical issues related to gender, race, ethnicity, disability, and religion. With knowledge comes power. So I'm here to give you knowledge because I'm here to empower you. I want to make you aware of ethics in psychology. This is the American Psychological Association, or APA. All I did was go to their homepage and take a screenshot of their homepage. It says, at APA, we support members at every stage of their professional journey. I want to know, what does that mean? How do we support members? One way the APA supports members is by creating a common set of ethical principles and shared standards to guide the professional and scientific activities of psychologists. Because what happens if we don't have a set of guiding principles? What happens when we don't have justice in research, integrity, fidelity? What happens when we don't have respect and beneficence in our research? The APA actually put these ethical principles together and told psychologists, if you're going to conduct research, you have to abide by each and every one of these, whether that's doing counseling, teaching, supervising, research activities. You must all adhere to these same ethical principles. But I'm here to tell you that that has not always been done. and that there are examples of unethical research conducted in the United States. I can't let you leave my class. I share this study in my ethics lecture in critical thinking and psychology, and I just thought about this. My critical thinking and psychology class, all of the modules end in ethics and decision making. And I show this next example in this next slide to illustrate, here's what happens when we don't have ethics. I think it's cool that in this class I kind of reversed it. We're kind of starting off with ethics. I love being a teacher. Anyway, I'm here to teach you about one of the most infamous examples of unethical research in the United States, at least, which was the Tuskegee syphilis study. Done for 40 years, where poor African American men were not told they had syphilis and were observed to see how the disease developed and progressed in untreated patients. Even after the use of penicillin became the standard treatment for syphilis in the 1940s, clearly early on into this study, the study started 1932, 8 years later, syphilis was the acceptable standard treatment. Even after penicillin became available and used, these men in this study continued to be denied treatment, and they were not given the opportunity to leave. I was so much happier as a psychologist before I learned about this study. And I want you to learn about this study. I want it to be an uncomfortable moment, an uncomfortable learning moment, because you shouldn't be comfortable learning that this study was allowed to exist. It was legally allowed. The U.S. Public Health Service said, yes, stamp of approval. This may happen. I want you to know that there's a history of the way certain cultures have been treated in research, and that might influence why certain groups, especially groups of Black men, of African Americans, Black Americans in this very country, might be hesitant and resistant to participate in research now. 40 years this went on, after penicillin was available. And they weren't allowed to leave. I really want this to sink in because there have been long-time consequences for African Americans and our unwillingness to participate in medical research and other social research. One study found that African Americans had less trust in researchers and were less likely to participate in research as a result of the Tuskegee experiment. Shocker. So, with this knowledge, I don't want you to feel like, no research is good research. We're all doomed. And why would Dr. Griffin ruin my day? I share this because knowledge is power, and I want you to have this knowledge because eventually a group was created to prevent this from happening ever again. So because when we know better, we can do better. So this is an example of, now that we know better, what have we done better? We as a society, a group of psychologists created an IRB organization. It's called Institutional Review Board. It must review and approve all research that involves human subjects. There is also a special commission within IRB that oversees research with animals in psychology. But it's like, yeah, now we have IRB. Now that people have died. So when we do better, how can we learn about treating people better before they die, not after? So let's do our best to learn about cross-cultural research in an ethical way that prevents people from being harmed. Let's see. If we were in class in a classroom right now, I would pause on this slide and I'd say, okay, we're going to do an in-class activity break. And you, either in small groups or individually, you would search the internet for other examples of research that was unethical as it relates to cross-cultural research. As you can see, the people in this photo are clearly of different cultures. I would say like the weird white American, WEIRD, white American culture is studying syphilis in Black American culture. However, let's say that if the research participants were also white, this would still very much so be an unethical study. So let's be clear on that. After this activity, or as part of this activity rather, I would have you share and discuss your results in class. And I'd pick on you, and I'd pick on you, and you. Or alternatively, you could identify the ethical principle that was violated in the research study you found. So anyway, we're not going to do that. But I want you to know that I have so many ideas for how we would do that if we were meeting in person. There are several required elements for conducting ethical research. Informed consent is the first element, and it is required for each study. Informed consent means that researchers must disclose information related to the study, and consent must be provided, meaning like I consent, I agree. Now that you have informed me and based on the information you have given me, I consent to participate in the study. You can put all of the wires on my head. Or you can inform me of all of the information related to the study, and I could decide, no, this isn't going to be comfortable for me, or maybe I have a pre-existing health condition, so this is not safe for me to join the study. So I do not give my consent. I will not participate in this research study. This option, the ability to opt in or opt out, has to be done at the beginning of the study, obviously not at the end. You can't strap somebody up and put stuff on their brain and collect data and afterwards be like, oh, do you agree to be in this study? No, that's not how that works. To ensure that consent is truly informed, a researcher must disclose certain things. Because of the syphilis study and because of other studies that have taken advantage of people in negative ways, we now have IRB, and IRB has given a set of guidelines, and that set says truly informed consent means that a researcher every time must disclose the purpose of the study, the expectations of the participants in the study, potential harm that may come from the experiment, consequences for not participating, possible benefits, incentives for participating. Do I get a gift card if I do the study? And the right to decline. Cultural considerations might include that informed consent may not be the custom of the culture, or the concept of informed consent may not even be understood because participation in some cultures might be obligatory. It might not even be a choice. Researchers must make the choice to participate. Research participants, the people participating in the study, must make the choice to participate freely, without fear. It needs to be voluntary. Freely without fear of duress, of getting into trouble, of rejection, or free of disappointment, without fear of disappointment. And furthermore, there are special considerations for those who are considered vulnerable populations. There's 3 vulnerable populations: children, prisoners, and persons with certain types of disabilities. Special populations might be different in other cultures. Children might be considered different in other cultures. Prisoners might be considered different in other cultures. And researchers must ensure that they are aware of this. It's the researcher's responsibility to be aware of the cultural differences before conducting research to ensure that participants are protected. Let's talk about ways to protect research participants. I want to make a pit stop and teach you about the differences between confidentiality and anonymity as ways to protect research participants. Sorry, it's all wiggling. I'm typing that note to myself. Confidentiality, when something's confidential, requires the researcher not release the data of a personal nature or to other scientists or to other groups without getting consent. So for example, if I were doing a medical round study or case study, I might say Miss G. This is Miss G, my participant. Anonymity, being anonymous, requires that personal information be kept separate from participant data. Code numbers are often assigned and personal data is destroyed. So for example, this might be participant 10. Do not assume that the same protections extend across cultures. Do not promise anonymity if you cannot guarantee it. More about this during sensitive topics section. So check this out. Enter water at your own risk. Talking about ethics, ethical research must disclose any risks and benefits to people who agree to participate in psychological studies. And people should be exposed to risk only if they fully understand the risks and only if the likely benefits clearly outweigh those risks. Researchers wishing to investigate implicit prejudice using the implicit association test need to be considerate of the consequences of providing feedback to participants about their unconscious biases, for example. Similarly, any manipulation that could potentially provoke serious emotional reactions, like the culture of honor study described in our chapter reading, or relevant or relatively permanent changes in people's beliefs or behaviors, like attitudes towards recycling. These need to be carefully reviewed by the IRB. Deception happens when a researcher deceives participants. For example, they use a cover story. Deception studies are not recognized as ethical in all cultures. They are here. We love us some deception studies in America. But they may not be appropriate for other cultures. They may not be allowed in other cultures. When deception studies happen, debriefing must occur right after participation in the deception study. Debriefing is a process of informing research participants as soon as possible of the purpose of the study, revealing any deceptions, and correcting any misconceptions they might have had as a result of participating. This may not be the same across cultures, and researchers must know the customs and ethical guidelines for the countries in which they are conducting the study. This is so much information. I'm so glad you're sticking it out. I really love learning about all this and teaching about all this. So we're coming down the home stretch. Let us recognize that not all topics are considered appropriate for study or examination outside of Western cultures. Talking about that biased lens, well, even all the studies that you may read about, if you read about, different things that are posted in social media or clicking on links that lead to, studies say, or if you watch the news, research says, let's talk about some sensitive topics in Western culture and how Western culture, how we might define what sensitive is differently than how other cultures define sensitive. Some topics and type of research are not accepted as openly as in Western cultures. We're pretty open here. We love poking and probing into everything. Some countries may punish individuals And some countries may imprison individuals for responses to research questions. If you've never been outside of the United States, this might be hard to imagine, but some people could go in other countries. Some people could wind up being imprisoned for their response to research questions. Kind of makes you think twice about all those Facebook quizzes, like which Harry Potter house am I? Like, I don't really think I could imagine taking that quiz or taking an online quiz that I think is kind of meaningless and thinking about, wow, is this like a fun quiz, or is this a quiz that could land me in jail for the way I respond? Wow. Sex, gender, and sexuality are frequently studied in Western cultures, which tend to be more open. We're pretty open over here, and I'm not mad at that. We're open to discussing and researching sex, gender, and sexuality, and research on these topics is easier to do and easier to find. Human rights issues are real issues that researchers who are conducting cross-cultural research must confront, right? This is City of Cape Town. Many countries have a history of imprisoning individuals accused of crimes against government or crimes against state. Other violations may include torture or death. So I hope this is exposing you. All I'm doing is exposing you to something that is different than what you're used to. Quick review. Psychologists are interested in the ways that cultural forces influence psychological processes, and we use research as a way to understand the way our emotions, identity, and relationships and decisions are affected. And before researchers can conclude that there are cross-cultural differences, they must consider cultural, social, and political contexts. To avoid getting it wrong, researchers should consider potential issues in methodology, or, the method, the way the research was designed. Researchers should consider ethnocentric bias to avoid getting it wrong, and the cultural attribution fallacy to avoid getting it wrong. What else do we need to be aware of? Researchers must also be aware of ethical considerations that extend beyond Western understandings and protections. Efforts must be made to ensure that informed consent is obtained before the study starts. Before, not after. Participation is voluntary, and risks and benefits are fully explained. Up next is our module on cultural products. Bye now.